Hello, everybody. My name is John Rae. I'm a blind rights activist from a long way back. The title of this presentation is Building Back Better. Will disabled lives finally be valued? And I think that's the fundamental question. Over the past 4.5 decades that I've been involved in the disability rights movement, many organizations have worked to educate employers and to assist disabled job seekers to find and retain employment. While I assume that all individuals who have been assisted by these efforts appreciate the work of these organizations, and during that period of time, the range of jobs that disabled people in Canada are now performing has increased a bit. Unfortunately, our overall level of employment has only inched up painfully slowly and very gradually and marginally. Our collective dilemma was brought home very dramatically to me when I read the first draft of the National Employment Strategy back in 2018. And one sentence in particular, which I quote, and it goes like this. This sentence jumped off the page to me, and I quote, "Many employers have told CCRW that they would not embark on hiring persons with disabilities without specific guidance and advice from employment agencies." Think about that. This analysis did not occur way back during the International Year of Persons with Disabilities in 1981. This analysis was provided in the year 2018. If you only reword that sentence slightly, what it says to me is that many employers really do not want us around at all. They would be happier if we would go away and stop darkening their doors altogether. Now, of course, that isn't going to happen. But I think many would prefer it if they didn't have to deal with us at all. This raises the question, how far have we really progressed? To what extent are our lives and experiences valued by employers and others? I suggest the answer is not a great deal. As Canada works to build back better, that oft-stated phrase, will things be different? Will our lives and our experience be valued more than they have been in the past or in the present? Only time will tell. Today we must deal with new pressures. During the pandemic, we've all been affected. Many Canadians qualified for the CRWDP that paid them up to $2,000 per month. While persons with disabilities, those of us who held the disability tax credit, received a meager one-time grant of $600. Now, throughout our lives, we have always had to confront and deal with the extra costs associated with our disability, and that has been exacerbated during the pandemic. This issue was highlighted to me recently in a November 26th Toronto Star article entitled "CRWDP and CRV Discriminated Against Canadians with Disabilities, New Charter Challenge Claims," an article by Rosa Saba. And it talks about a woman named Valerie Jacobs who has filed a human rights complaint alleging this discrimination. Why should this have been needed? What will happen to her case, we don't know at this point. But we also must think about what will happen when the pandemic finally ends and government supports are removed. And at that point, I fear governments will return to their old austerity ways. And what will happen to us then? Today, we see some new trends. The work of the Black Lives Matter movement has finally brought attention to systemic black racism. A lot of Canadians believe that doesn't happen here. That's what happens down south of our border with the United States. Think again. Systemic black racism is too alive and well in this country as well as in the United States. We've also seen the release of the Truth and Reconciliation report and the report of the inquiry into missing and murdered Indigenous women and girls. These reports have brought new attention, long overdue attention, to the circumstances of these communities. It's about time, in my view, but I have to wonder, why were the issues and circumstances of Black or Indigenous persons with disabilities not given attention during those reports? And especially from the Indigenous community, where there is a significant number of persons with disabilities. Corporate Canada gets criticism. In November, Angus Reid Institute and the Rick Hansen Foundation released a new report. It will probably disappoint some service providers listening to this, but I doubt that it came as any great surprise to us who have a disability. Some of its findings include 40% believe that employers fall short of what is needed to hire persons with disabilities. An additional 39% believe that employers have a long way to go to adequately support their disabled employees. 48% believe that employers are particularly bad at hiring persons who are considered severely disabled. And on the results of this study goes. When I think back, the disability rights movement in Canada really got started in the early 70s, especially in Western Canada. It was developed partly as Jim Dirksen, former executive director of the Council of Canadians with Disabilities, talks about the rehabilitation industry. He was talking about organizations, service providers like CNIB, the March of Dimes, and other organizations of that ilk, where we as disabled people are confronted by a bevy of professionals, doctors, social workers, counselors, therapists, and the like, people who are ready to study us, diagnose us, medicalize us, speak for us, make a good living off of us, but rarely give us the opportunity to speak for ourselves or to take meaningful part in decisions that directly affect us. Why is that still the case? Over the last couple of decades, we have seen the development of the social model of disability. While this new approach does provide a more realistic and progressive view of disability, many of us feel that it has not gone nearly far enough because it has done little or nothing to redress the power imbalance between us and those who purport to serve us. As a result, some of us, including myself, are of the view that a new paradigm is required, one where we see ourselves not just as one other group of stakeholders who may be included at tables, but that we must start seeing ourselves as rights holders, because after all, these decisions affect us, and we must be given a preeminent place at all tables where discussions and decisions about new pieces of legislation, policies, and programs are being discussed. Unfortunately, we still have a fair ways to go before we get there, before we implement the old adage, the new adage of nothing about us without us. Workers' compensation began in Germany and Britain, and came to Canada as a result of the Meredith report. In early 1900s, Sir William Meredith was appointed to head a royal commission, and that report led to what we in the injured workers movement talk about as a historic compromise. That compromise involved employers providing injured workers with reliable benefits in return for workers giving up the right to sue their employers when they became ill or injured at work. There were 6 principles at the head of that historic compromise. Unfortunately, as years have gone on, what was developed as the Workers' Compensation Board, and now known as the WSIB, has changed from an organization that focused on providing benefits to injured workers to an insurance model where cost cutting has become its prime work, cost cutting that happens on the backs of injured workers. Today, injured workers are often under a great deal of surveillance, where their own treating physicians' reports are not welcomed. And the most egregious part of all is a practice that I found hard to believe when I first heard about it, and that is deeming. An injured worker's benefits can be reduced by a job that they are deemed to be able to acquire. Never mind that these are phantom jobs and not real jobs. Never mind that these are jobs that the individual doesn't have. They are deemed to be able to get them. And as a result, their benefits are reduced accordingly. I can't think of many more egregious violations of the human rights of disabled people than the practice of deeming. We in civil society often criticize governments for working in silos. And that's understandable, because they do. However, if we looked inwardly, if we took an introspective look at how our own organizations operate, I'm afraid we might have to admit that we also work in silos. And that needs to change. We all need to work in a more holistic way. Take the whole business of work. There are those who say, go look and get a job. That's fine. However, if accessible training isn't available, if housing isn't obtainable in the community where a person lives, if accessible technology isn't available, and I assure you that some employers still buy technology that they know isn't usable by everybody. If transportation to and from that place of employment isn't present, and if an inclusive work environment where the person is valued and really made to feel a part of the organization, if all of these factors aren't present, the idea of finding and retaining work can fall apart. And that's why we all need to work in a more holistic manner. Today, we talk about nothing about us without us. That has become the clarion message of the disability rights movement. Many organizations talk a good line. Many try to sound like they have become more progressive. Fortunately, some have, but many more talk this talk rather than walking the walk and actually implementing progressive policies that are more inclusive, including persons with disabilities. This conference itself is, in my mind, part of the problem. The group who organized it was not much made up of us. There were very few persons with disabilities in the leadership of organizing this conference. And if we can't walk the talk, if we don't bring more persons with disabilities directly into the leadership of events like this, how can we possibly expect the wider community to do it? We need to lead by example, and that's not happening. And speaking of leading by example, that's what government needs to do. Government must become model employers. Over the last few years, there have been a fair number of anti-poverty reports released. Some of them have had some measure of impact, not a great deal, but usually when they are released, governments are required within a specified period of time to respond to them. Well, instead of giving a comprehensive response, too often governments have offered what I consider to be a callous response. There's a solution to your unemployment. Just go out and get a job. Well, that's a nice idea, but these same governments do not give us any indication of where are all of these jobs that they expect us to suddenly go out and get. Where are these jobs? Where are they? They don't tell us, and they also do not tend to put into place new programs to encourage employers to do a better job of hiring us. Today, we hear many employers crying the blues that they have jobs that they cannot fill. That may be true. There may be reasons for this. Some say that today's workers lack some of the skills that today's workforce needs. In some cases, there is bad pay or bad hours, maybe not enough hours. In other cases, scheduling is a problem. And in some others, individuals are still nervous about going into a place of employment because of the pandemic, something that we hope will soon abate, or because they have care responsibilities for loved ones. Yet the question becomes, in this case, how many of these same employers have reached out to the disabled community? I suggest not nearly enough. There are many from among our midst who are ready, willing, and anxious to work. And if employers reached out more to our community, I'm sure that we could help fill some of those vacancies and put our skills and talents to work. Yet, once again, it's pretty clear that our presence is not yet valued or wanted. The whole area of representation is also a problem. Today, persons with disabilities are not present in sufficient numbers at tables and in offices where important decisions are made that affect all of us, including persons with disabilities. I refer to the boardrooms where decisions about what products will be manufactured and to what extent will they be accessible. Boardrooms where organizational policies are set. The newsrooms where stories are determined, which ones will be covered, and what slant will be put on those stories. Will they be news stories, or will they be pity-filled public interest stories? And we aren't nearly well enough represented in political party offices where decisions get made about candidates who run and party platforms, nor in municipal planning departments where decisions about community access are made. And perhaps most importantly, we aren't adequately represented in the offices of ministers, provincial and territorial premiers, or the office of the Prime Minister himself. And after all, that's where important public policy decisions are made, decisions that affect all of us. Without us being there, it is very easy for our needs and issues to either be forgotten about or callously ignored. And I have to say, I'm one who suggests both happens. Redressing this imbalance and deficiency and bringing more of us into these organizations and at these levels would do a number of things. It would put some of us to work, and that would help the slow pace at which our employment levels have progressed. But it would also bring needed in-house expertise on disability into those offices where it could be applied to those decisions. And if more and more organizations created policies and especially products, Canada could become the envy of the world as other countries do more to implement their obligations under the UN Convention on the Rights of Disability, a convention which has encouraged many nations around the world to do more than they used to do to assist their own residents and citizens with disabilities. Well, it's time that we wrote a new story. And that's how I want to bring this presentation to a close. I recently received from a friend a TED Talk, by a woman named, and I hope I will pronounce her name correctly, Chimamanda Ngozi Adichie. It's a tough one. She is a Nigerian storyteller and author who has written novels, short stories, all kinds of things. When she was young, she became an early reader, and she read stories about stories from Britain and the United States about young children. At the age of 7, she started to write, and her stories contained similar people. They were white skinned and blue eyed. They played in the snow. They ate apples and they talked about the weather. Never mind that she lived in Nigeria and at that point had never left her native country. In Nigeria, there was no snow. They ate mangoes, not apples. And they didn't talk much about the weather because they didn't need to. In addition, her characters drank a lot of ginger beer. Now, remember, she was Nigerian and at that point had never tasted a sip of ginger beer. But she developed a desperate desire to try it. Now, you may be wondering, what in the world does this Nigerian's story have to do with our circumstance? I suggest it has a lot to do. The title of the TED Talk is The Danger of the Single Story. When people are young, impressionable, and vulnerable, when you hear the same story all over the place, when you hear it frequently and consistently, it is easy to become affected by the stories you hear. In our case, as we grow up, too many of us heard the old story, you can't do that. You won't be able to do that. There's no point even trying. Because no one's going to hire you anyway. And as many of us have grown older, we can tell the stories of stacks and stacks of, I wish I could hire you here, but. The buts are almost endless. But the impact of those rejections can be devastating. And I think that explains why many of us are not in the workforce, not in the job market, not seeking jobs because many of us have simply given up. When will our lives and expertise and creativity finally be valued and recognized and us encouraged? It is time that we wrote a new story. It is time that we wrote a new paradigm of rights holders where the lives and expertise of persons with disabilities are not just encouraged and valued, but where we get to participate directly in a preeminent way in the development of any kind of legislation, policy, and program that affects us. We must be at all of these tables. It's time that governments stop turning to service providers to speak for us when we never gave those organizations the right to do so. We have formed our own organizations. And if we can begin writing in this story, there will be hope for future generations of Canadians with disabilities. If we don't do this and change our ways, we run the risk of consigning future generations of Canadians with disabilities to the margins, to the scrap heap of history, as I call it. And that is unnecessary and tragic. We must do a better job, and I leave that to you. I hope the rest of this conference will focus on writing a new story of better days for persons with disabilities. Thank you very much.